Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm so pleased and happy to sort of almost end October's Filipino History Month with two amazing people. My name is Dr. Nina Ha, and I am the director of the APDIA Plus Center, which is at Virginia Tech. Before we begin, especially on programs like this, we always start with a short land acknowledgement and labor recognition of at Virginia Tech. So Virginia Tech acknowledges that we live and work on the Tudelo and Monacan people's homeland, and we recognize their continued relationships with their lands and waterways. We further acknowledge that the Morrill Land Grant College Act of 1862 enabled the Commonwealth of Virginia to finance and found Virginia Tech through the forced removal of Native nations from their lands in California and other areas in the West. Virginia Tech acknowledges that its Blacksburg campus sits partly on land that was previously the site of the Smithfield and Solitude plantations owned by members of the Preston family. Between the 1770s and the 1860s, the Prestons and other local white families that owned parcels of what became Virginia Tech also owned hundreds of enslaved people. Enslaved Black people generated resources that financed Virginia Tech's predecessor institution, the Preston and Olin Institute, and they also worked on the construction of its building. So as always, we wanted to just acknowledge our history and our path to do better in the future. So I would like to begin by introducing our featured guest for today, Dr. April Faye Manalang is an associate professor of interdisciplinary studies in the College of Liberal Arts at Norfolk State University. Her research interests include immigration, transnationalism, sociology of religion, questions of citizenship, as well as race and ethnicity. And Hans Carlo Rivera is a mental health specialist at Virginia Tech. They are pursuing a Master of Public Health at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill with a focus on global mental health research and advocacy. Their work highlights sustainable and equitable community-based solutions to mental health issues and stigma. So without further ado, I am going to pass it off to the both of you, if that's okay, and then let me know when you want me to show please your slideshow.
Sure. I'll as Dr. Ha mentioned, my name is Hans Carlo Rivera. I will leave it to Dr. Manong if she would like to open with any words. Welcome. Yes.
Thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules. I can only imagine how hectic all of your schedules are, and it's an honor and privilege to be here. Thanks so much for including me in this very important conversation this afternoon. I look forward to getting right into it.
Can you see Dr. Manala? Yes, okay.
Yes, I can see. Thank you.
All right. So I prepared this slide deck just for ease of reference for our discussion today, kind of building up context. So again, thank you, as Dr. Manong said, and joining us this afternoon. We'll be presenting on psychiatrics, healing through storytelling for nurses in the Filipino diaspora. Kind of as we go through our content today, thinking of how our past and our history has kind of shaped the modern outcomes and policies that we're currently existing within, thinking about systemic and structural factors that we exist in terms of accessing care, what labor looks like in terms of the Philippine migration, as well as talking about nurses who are definitely the focus of today's content, but thinking of also kind of how that correlates to overseas Filipino workers in general, which we'll kind of go through. Okay, so as Dr. Ha mentioned previously, it is Filipino American History Month. Thinking of cicatrix, if you are not familiar with the word cicatrix, I also was not until I Googled an appropriate creative title for this session today. Cicatrix is it's a forgotten scar. It's something that has healed, but is still present and still shapes on how we interact with our environment. It's also related to the concept of tree bark being overgrown due to previous injury to the tree bark or tissue. So this is a graphic from Dr. Rona, who is a clinical psychologist, does a lot of outreach, but then also programming and infographics on Instagram. And so this is one of the graphics put together, and you can see kind of towards the branches, towards the top of the tree canopy, some things that we often uplift when we talk about Filipinos and Filipino culture and history, things like karaoke, tinigling, which is a cultural dance, the different foods you see like ube and hopia and lumpia and adobo, and thinking of how there is so much diversity within the Filipino people and diaspora. But then there's also things that maybe are not talked about. We think of the sequelae of mental health, such as addiction. We look at roots of activism in our communities, pakikiramdam, which means kind of our internal feelings, what our moods are, diasporic grief, for example. And so just wanting to acknowledge the multifaceted legacy of what Filipino American History Month is. And I also have some resources and folks that call into the space later on in the presentation. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, thinking of Filipino American History Month, providing some background context of what Filipino American history looks like. If you attended the APDIA Plus Center's talk earlier this month from Dr. Javier Diego Luis on the first Asians in the Americas, there are some correlates with this. We can see that in 1587, the first Filipinos landed in what is now Morro Bay, in Turtle Island, California, in the United States. And so thinking of that within the context of Spanish colonization at the time, and what that meant for folks who were coming over. They were not defined as Filipinos, the indigenous people of the Philippines. They actually came over and were labeled as Indios Luzones, meaning indigenous people of Luzon, which is one of the major island groups in the Philippines. Kind of fast forwarding, just again, in the interest of time to condense kind of the timeline. 1850s, the Filipinos migration to Hawaii as indentured workers. If you are familiar with the cicadas that come from Ilocos region in the Philippines, actually my grandmother's from there. They work on sugar plantations in Hawaii to provide labor in order with the intention of going back to the Philippines once they have saved up enough money to support their families and lifestyles back home. Then in 1898, again, keeping in mind during this time, Spanish colonial rule, the Spanish-American War happened and the US annexed the Philippines as a colonial part of its legacy. And so thinking of how that shaped through the legacy of white supremacy, colonialism, how that shaped the impact of the United States on the Philippines and its history, really thinking in context. In 1904, the St. Louis World's Fair happened in St. Louis. Go figure. 1904, they actually had a human zoo exhibit in which they had showcased Filipinos and had dress them up in indigenous garb and show kind of again, the impact of colonialism of saving these savages, quote unquote. And again, keeping in mind that it was already colonized by the Spanish for 333 years prior to this. Then again, fast forwarding 1941, the US entered World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor and entered war in the Pacific Theater, specifically with Japan. At this time, I really want to highlight the importance of this in order to bolster the war efforts for the United States in the Pacific Theater. They actually outsourced labor to recruit Filipino men into the military, particularly the Navy, and then also Filipino women to work as nurses. During this time, the United States had established many different nursing schools in order to build up the nursing infrastructure and workforce. And because of that, from the 1940s, the Philippines had this workforce and nursing school set up that was up to quote unquote Western standards. After World War II, shortly, the Philippines gained its independence from the United States, actually on July 4th. And so recognizing like Filipino independence within the context of colonial legacy. Now thinking of what that looks like for the legacy here in the United States in the 1960s, you can see the I Hotel, the International Hotel, kind of the Manila men who were in California. They kind of were located in this hotel for cheaper housing, and the I Hotel was actually slated to be demolished. There was a large community kind of convergence to kind of save the I Hotel, but ultimately the building was torn down. Also in the 1960s, Larry Young and the Manongs had the AWOC, agricultural workers, that had a coalition in order to provide security for not just Filipino workers in agriculture, but a wide coalition of different races and ethnicities as well. It worked in tandem with the United Agricultural Workers, thinking of Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez, and worked to support workers' rights in the United States, especially for Filipinos. And then in 1972, martial law was declared in the Philippines by former dictator Ferdinand Marcos. This kind of set the groundwork for the export of labor that we see now in current day, with Filipinos leaving en masse to different parts of the world in order to provide for their families because of higher wages that are available in the countries outside of the Philippines. Go to the next slide. So again, honing in that labor and leverage that happened. Currently, as of 2023, over 2.3 million people are classified as overseas Filipino workers. That meaning folks who are Filipino citizens who are granted temporary authorization to leave the country and work abroad, and with the expectation of sending money back to the Philippines. As of 2023, cash remittances made up over 9% of the Philippine GDP, equivalent to 39.1 billion US dollars. The largest share of those remittances are coming from the United States, over a third. So thinking of a 3% of the total Philippine GDP coming from money that Filipinos in the US are sending back to the Philippines. Tying this back to the colonial legacy of US and Spain, I mentioned already the impact of World War II and founding nursing schools at the time in the 1940s. And now with the context of COVID-19, the Philippine government actually put a moratorium on all overseas labor export during the pandemic. And this was pretty devastating to the local economy, but then also for the contracts that were already slated to be filled abroad. Thinking not only nurses, but also cruise line workers, domestic aides, home health aides, tutors, teachers. The economic scale on a global level was definitely felt. And then thinking of the fact that the average annual income in the Philippines is only about 6,000 US dollars as of 2023, and recognizing that many Filipinos in the Philippines make far less than that average number. And then finally, approximately 150 nurses in the United States have Filipino identity or origin. And so again, thinking of the scale at which this is happening, how the workforce has developed over time, the economic policies, excuse me, that have pushed Filipinos abroad. It doesn't exist in a vacuum, and thinking about the wider system is something that we'll come back to in a little bit. Next one. Okay, so Filipinos in the United States. As of 2022, census data showed that 4.1 million Filipinos were in the United States. That makes up about 17% of all Asian Americans in the country. During COVID-19, again, anti-Asian violence spiked by 150%, and over 300 Filipinos were targeted specifically out of close to 4,000 attacks on Asian Americans just between March 2020 and February 2021. I have some of the names of the folks who were targeted. Some survived, such as Bill Macari and Noah Quintana in New York City, the Roque family in California, but then others such as Juanita Falcon and Angelo Quinto. Not so lucky, they unfortunately have passed. May they rest in peace. in the context of the United States, again, the legacy of colonialism, white supremacy that is apparent, thinking of the model minority myth. For a long time, generations of Filipinos have suffered silently, not wanting to make a fuss. This is part in due to cultural values of persevering, working hard, but then also in some cases having their employment or visa status compromised if they were to raise complaints, thinking about withholding of wages, exploitation of labor, hiding of passports by their employers, especially if they are domestic or home health aides. Unfortunately, the reality is that many people, not just Filipinos, but within the global labor market, are vulnerable to a lot of these kinds of exploitation. We also, I'm going to mention the healthy immigrant paradox, just because it's this concept of when families come over, or when individuals come over to the United States or wherever they immigrate to, whether that be Australia, the UK, Singapore, a lot of folks are healthier than their subsequent generations, kind of their offspring, their children. They have better health outcomes than the folks that come after them. And so when we think of generational differences also, this kind of compiles into kind of a lack of perceived understanding or shared understanding between the different generations, not just, again, Filipinos, but kind of wider generational immigrant communities as well. Only 73% of Filipino Americans have never used any mental health care service, and only 17% of those 73% have ever received support from a social support network or a faith-based institution. As we'll talk about also, the Philippines has a very religious legacy, also a remnant of Spanish colonization. Slide, please. I have some mental health terms rooted in Psikolohiya Filipino, which is Filipino psychology, indigenous Filipino psychology. Not going to go over each individual one. You can probably read on the screen. Some things that I wanted to highlight because Dr. Manong will build off of them later are the concept of utang na loob, which is a deep sense of indebtedness, especially one that cannot be paid back. It's this kind of unspoken thing that many people feel, especially like kind of parallel to filial piety or intergenerational respect. Something that is between familial ties or even friendships, where there's this expectation because of a favor or because of a right doing. There is this sense of being owed, but it's not going to be acted upon, usually, unless it's weaponized, which does happen as well. Also, the idea of kapwa, which is a sense of oneness or singularity within a social group, kind of this idea of your own identity being an extension of yourself, reaching out into the community. Again, thinking of trees and the metaphor between, collectivistic cultures versus individualistic cultures. And so, again, this couple kind of shows the or I in the situation or social situation. Ikaw is you and your own conceptual understanding, your own history. Tayo is kind of this bridge in between, and then kapwa is all the things that are left unsaid. This again intuitive sense of connection. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Highlighting some of the disparities specific to COVID-19 in the nursing workforce. Highlighting the orange piece of the pie chart. Although Filipinos only make up 4% of the nursing workforce in the United States, they accounted for almost a third of all deaths related to COVID-19 in the first 6 months of the pandemic. Again, this is related to working status. They might be in more vulnerable positions in a hospital or clinic, maybe more frontline work related to their job duties. And because of this, we do see a disparity in terms of outcome, not just in mortality, but also subsequent issues related to mental health, other physiological issues such as cancers. And so this is something that not only has mental health impacts, but also physical as well. Next slide. Yeah, this is a rich picture. Not going to go over every single aspect of it, but this just kind of illustrates how complex and interwoven all the things that I've already said related to the history of Filipinos and the Philippine export of labor kind of interplays with mental health, intergenerational trauma, indigenous cultural values, as well as the modern day implications of COVID-19. The next one is also going to just show kind of the relationships in a more quantitative sense. This is largely rooted in an academic project that I had earlier in my master's program, but thinking of looking at the legacy between colonialism, mental health, availability of culturally competent providers, and also just the willingness to engage in therapy by many Filipino patients and nurses in the community.
It's very extensive.
Very expensive,
Yes.
very expensive. Again, this is not for you to kind of decipher and dig deeper into, although if you would like to, happy to share this concept map with you. But again, just emphasizing the really interwoven and complex relationship between all these different variables when we're considering public health, mental health, the challenges that come with the export of labor to the United States from the Philippines, as well as other countries. Next slide. Okay, actually, I am going to leave the next few slides. I'm going to skip them just because I think April will do, excuse me, Dr. Manalong will do a much better job of being able to highlight some of the individual stories that come from our research with Healing Heritage. But again, these are kind of personas that are used in public health based on research and interviews and anecdotes, being able to build these personas of unique things that an individual in the system, existing in the system, might interact or engage with. So Annabelle's story is really rooted in being an overseas Filipino worker, working to support not only her family here in the States that she's established since moving to the US, but also trying to support her family in the Philippines as well and sending money back. Yeah, we'll just kind of go through the next one. The next one. Miko is an example of someone who was born and raised in the United States. Immigrated to Florida at a young age from the Philippines, but then kind of has assimilated into American culture, has American values, and then is noticing kind of the discrepancy or the tension between his own family's upbringing and cultural expectations versus ones that he was normed with living here in the United States. Next one, and then the next one.
Oh, this, sorry.
Yeah. And then Connie's story, she looks so much like my aunt. So I just want to call into that as well. But an example of someone who's maybe more established in their nursing career, immigrated to Sacramento from the Philippines in California and worked to establish herself before raising a family, moving to Chicago. Recognizes faith interplays a lot with her own mental health upbringing and resiliency as well. But then also knowing that, you know, grief and moral injury that occur within experiencing the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic really hit close to home, especially when thinking about friends and family who had passed away because of the pandemic. And then again, there's another empathy map after this, showing what is heard, what is seen, what Connie might think and feel, what they might say and do. Let's see. But again, I'll leave kind of those more in-depth analyses to Dr. Manalong to kind of bring forth from our research. Slide. Quality characteristics. These are just looking at things that are really salient that are coming up in the community. And then the next slide. These two things. In thinking of the population needs, community needs, the two things that came out of this project were really looking at solution that uplifts the voices of community members and also works to dismantle stigma through diverse mental health resources. If you visit our website, healingheritage.org, you can see the work that we're doing in terms of trying to understand and listen to the stories and uplift them for Filipino nurses, not only in the United States, but in the Philippines as well, potentially other locations in the future. But then also we have a resource hub for folks who may be struggling with anything related to mental health, immigration needs, and that is something that is available on our website. And so this is something that we try to, again, provide back into the community, recognizing the need for it. Dr. Manalong asked me to share kind of a personal anecdote, bringing this close to home. These are pictures of parts of my family. I have a very big family. As I mentioned, the Filipino diaspora is pretty global in terms of reach. My great aunt was in Australia. I have other family members in Australia. I have family in Switzerland, in France, in the UK, in Canada, all over the United States, all over the Philippines as well. And in thinking of bringing this closer to home and thinking and reflecting back on what we've brought up today, this idea of the global impacts of the export of labor in the Philippines. My grandma, kind of close to the center of the screen, in the left-hand picture, she had Alzheimer's, and her caretaker, my uncle Randy, Peter Randy, in the yellow in the left-hand picture, with that battery shirt in the right-hand photo, actually came and lived with our family to help take care of my Lola before she passed in 2017. But he really became part of our family. He left the Philippines shortly after his two kids were born. They were both young girls, and never went back to the Philippines. And he passed away in 2021, June 2021, working as a home health aide, formal training in engineering, but working to provide financial support for his family back in the Philippines. Never got to see his family again. So when you think of not only the emotional impacts and health impacts on the overseas family workers, imagine being separated from your families, right, for extended periods of time, not knowing if you're going to see them again. You know, and if you ask Filipinos in the diaspora, I will be willing to bet 4 times out of 5, you will be able to find parallels to this data, through this history, to their unique stories as well. And so thinking of what the story or the history shows up as, it can be really kind of disconnected when we think of it in large scale terms. And so again, this is just to kind of bring us closer to home and ground us in the meaning and the impact of our work, and recognizing how these systems play throughout our lives. As I mentioned, just sharing some resources, some Instagram accounts to follow if you would like. Tony Rosa Speaks, he's a doctoral candidate studying Filipino history. I follow him diligently on Instagram. Also, Mighty History PH is an account that largely looks at Filipino history within the Philippines, but really recognizing that they are parallel, right? A lot of the misunderstandings, especially in second generation Filipino immigrants or later generations, the misunderstandings or misconceptions of the motherland when we think of maybe, you know, things as trivial or maybe not so trivial, like Philippine flag graduation stoles, or Filipino versus Filipinx. These kind of conversations, a lot of times people are refusing to understand the opposite perspective or the other perspective. And so really thinking of how we can grow in our knowledge and meaning making together moving forward. As I mentioned, it is October is Filipino American History Month. There is FONS, the Filipino American National Historical Society, and then Dr. Dawn Mabalon pioneered a lot of this work. She also too has passed away as of 2018.
She was a sort of a peer of mine in graduate school.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And really pioneered Filipino specific legacies and stories. And so to your point with, you know, grad school cohort, because I know this is something that Dr. Ha and myself talk a lot about. The importance of data disaggregation in Asian American communities is something that really needs to be advocated for in order for us to better understand and form a more full understanding of what these experiences mean. Again, if you have the data so aggregated or so depersonalized, where it doesn't really mean anything, it can be really hard to see the impact or the need or the connection to us as individuals. I think the next slide starts to introduce kind of the project. So I, again, thinking of a personal connection, I met Dr. Manalong at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. in January of 2023. I attended a talk that she gave with the at Georgetown University, the
Mhm.
specific school for international affairs. And again, this is just less than 2 years ago, of me talking with Dr. Manalong, kind of looping in our other colleague, Dr. Christian Gloria over at Columbia. And again, less than 2 years later, our team has expanded to over now 5 project sites, recruiting interviews for Filipino nurses across the United States as well as in the Philippines. And we have a team of around 15 people. So really, when you find people who are aligned and committed to sharing in the work, it's really, really incredible to see what can be done in such a short amount of time. And so with the next slide, I will go ahead and pass it on to Dr. Manalong. These are our co-investigators for the Healing Heritage Project, and Dr. Hall already introduced. So I will let Dr. Manalong kind of jump in. This is the which of my slides in the presentation, and
I'm gonna stop sharing that.
Yeah.
Okay.
so just thank you for listening, and we'll continue the conversation.
Can you all hear me and see me? Okay. Well, thank you, Carlo, for an amazing and thorough presentation. And I want to build on that. And I want to take on the theme of being personal and intimate. I wanted to lift out some of the aspects of Carlo's very brilliant talk and maybe think more emotionally and intimately about some of these experiences that Carlo is highlighting. And so the meaning and impact is really important. The question about why we're spending this time and effort to highlight the story of Filipino nurses or Filipino nurses. And so, as you may recall, as Carlo accurately stated, during the pandemic, and especially in 2020, there was a 145% anti-Asian hate spike. And as mentioned previously, over 1/3 of all the nurse deaths during the pandemic were Filipino nurse deaths. And so I'm in Hampton Roads, Virginia, and I come from the largest Filipino community in the South. And so we have many Filipino nurses in the community. I am part of my community. And so it was a very personal loss. And like Carlo, I have family members that are also nurses across the diaspora. And the Filipino nurses reached out to me and they were worried that no one would care or that no one would see them. And that really struck me. That really struck me. So I don't have a background in medicine or in nursing, but because I felt so moved and worried that no one would continue to see or care about the Filipino nurses, it's what motivated me and felt compelled to move forward with highlighting their stories. And I'm very grateful to Carlo and my investigators, Dr. Gloria and Dr. Chow, and my team members who have also taken up this cause. And so I just wanted to talk to you about some of the themes that have emerged from this study and about, I guess, just some of my personal thoughts about it and my ruminations and why this research matters on a broader scale. And after I talk about that, then I'd also like to hear from the audience and from colleagues about how this project matters to them and what strikes them about this project. And so some of the themes that emerged across these interviews with our Filipino nurses across the country and in the Philippines is the irony of the hero narrative. And so this idea that during COVID and during the pandemic, as you are all aware, there were on the news, it was constantly, oh, we have COVID heroes and they're amazing. And some of you may have seen it on the news, in the nightly news. But what made it ironic is that, yes, there were many medical health caregivers and providers that did amazing things. Yet at the same time, over 1/3 of the Filipino nurses were dying, and there was not there was almost no media coverage about their deaths. And so how can one feel like a hero if they're also rendered invisible? And so that was a bit of an irony that they felt personally and deeply. And so that's something that is permeating throughout these interviews. And we're still working on this project. It's still unraveling. And another aspect of this is that when we think about sociology and we think about stories of immigrants, they're like historically, they have been concentrated on like bi-coastal stories and bigger cities. Like we think about immigrants and especially Asian American immigrants, like, oh, they're on the East Coast, they're on the West Coast, or they're in New York. And that is important. We're also attempting to advance our understanding of Asian Americans in America beyond the coasts and thinking about, well, what about Asian Americans in the South? What about their stories? Or what about in the Midwest? And so that's also why we're trying to expand this project, because we often think about Asian Americans associated with bigger cities and bi-coastal understandings. And so we're really trying to have a broader understanding. Moreover, when we think about the history of sociology and how it's been approached in the United States, is like American sociology is very American. It's very nationalistic. And we read lots of stories about immigrants in America to America. As if that's the only story. But as Carlo rightly stated and in his personal stories about that, and it's maybe something all of you can on some level or on a personal level have family members that are across the diaspora, that's not the full story, that we still may have and do have transnational connections. And so this project is seeking to go beyond nationalistic borders and take a more transnational approach, because the overwhelming majority of sociological research is nationalistic, it's US centered. And that's not necessarily bad, it's just there's more to the story than that. It really is not, it's somewhat artificial in a way, because it's not really sharing the full story of our complicated and multiplex connections that we have across boundaries and national borders. And so that's another aspect that is being lifted out that we're trying to do. And so throughout this project, really our vision is to think about, well, what narratives are being told? What is being surfaced here? And so it's a complex set of stories. As you can tell from the history, that the thorough history that Carlos shared, it's also interwoven with the colonization of the Filipinos and why there are so many Filipino nurses in the US, because the United States and the Philippines had a colonial relationship. And so one could call that from the scholar Galtong like a form of violence, of how these kinds of economic superstructures create these type of dynamics that create and cause certain groups of people to become vulnerable. And then how our cultural and religious beliefs can reinforce that. And so thinking about the internal diversity of our Asian American communities, this is another part of what our project seeks to advance understandings about. Is so with respect to what Carlo was saying with utang ng loob, which means indebtedness. Because the heart of the question that people often ask me is, well, why did so many Filipino nurses die? That's a shocking amount. And what's crazy is years later after COVID, people still are not aware of it. It's still not widely known. And I don't blame people for knowing it. It's because there's so little research being done on it. There's so little media coverage. And I thank my team, and I thank Carlo, and I thank Nina for lifting out these stories, for giving us a platform to allow us to share these hidden stories. And so why did so many die? Well, because 1 out of 20 nurses in the world are Filipino, because the United States and the global economic structure lends itself that this is a highly lucrative and easily transferable export. That is the largest export that the Philippines has, are Filipino nurses. And so because of that economic relationship, it's made them already vulnerable, because there's simply the most of them among all the nurses in the world. That's one reason. And the second reason, when we think about religiosity, which is actually one of my main areas of research, is what I found in the research and in conducting the interviews thus far, is that a lot of Filipino nurses did not complain because they felt indebtedness, or utang ng loob. They felt a sense of gratitude for the privilege and honor to serve others. So even though so many were dying, they felt grateful to God for the opportunity to serve others, which is a strong cultural value. And they felt that, like, oh, well, why didn't they complain? Because you could complain, right? You could complain, but they did not complain because if they felt indebted, right, that if they complained, then that's being ungrateful for their blessing, the blessing and opportunity to serve others, their blessing of American citizenship. And so these are some of the themes that are coming out in the interviews, and we still have more to do. But this is just this gives you an insight of how these multiplex dynamics can create such a thing where over 1/3 of all the Filipino nurses that died were like that. That's such a shocking amount. And so I hope that this makes sense. And I hope that this project is helping us get a greater understanding and empathy for the internal diversity of our Asian American communities, and thinking about the deep narratives of what we can learn about who we are, and this trauma and loss, and how we can be more intentional in our support for community and for others. And I will end with just one thought about just all of this, and just it's bringing me back. This is a very personal project, because during the time of this project, and maybe some of you are coming back to this moment with me, like we were all isolated. We didn't know if the world was going to end, and for a lot of people that we know and have loved, it did end for them. And so it's really important to honor our Filipino nurses for their contributions. Some are still suffering, they still have trauma. And at that time, it turns out I was pregnant during COVID, during the height of anti-Asian hate spike. And so I just felt like, wow, like if I felt this so vulnerable, like hobbling around pregnant during the height of anti-Asian hate during COVID, I can't imagine the pain, the suffering, the fear, and the vulnerability of what our Filipino nurses went through. And yet they were still resilient, and they turned and relied on their faith to God, and yet still so grateful for their ability to serve others. I hope that this touched you personally, because this is a personal project first about our community. Thank you.
Okay, I want to open it up to questions. Yes.
I'm wondering if it is possible to know which kind of nursing jobs or specific field or positions for those Filipino nurses with high mortality rate during pandemic. And also I want to know the death rate for normal Filipinos during pandemic, which one get infected. So we want to know, the first thing is if Filipino or specific populations are naturally more sensitive for COVID or not. Another thing is I want to know if the system lack of some training, protection, or specific protection mechanism for specific positions. And these positions are, I mean, accidentally or specifically being filled by particular population.
Well, thank you, first of all, for your question. And like, I don't know what specific fields or specialties in the among nurses suffered more or less. This project is seeking to understand all Filipino nurses who worked during the pandemic and their perspective. But there, as far as I'm aware of, I do not know if there are any
I
actually
think you
statistics
need
that
help from the
indicate that.
healthcare related professionals to help you identify these, because this is not a personal issue. This is a potential race related issue and also
Absolutely.
healthcare related issue.
Absolutely. And so
Yeah.
this project is absolutely interdisciplinary. We are drawing from the fields of public health and public health, sociology, anthropology, and so and religious studies, to name a few. And so and in medicine, of course. So I think that you bring out a great point about the interdisciplinary aspect of this project and how learning more about these specific statistics would be helpful. And so, but I'm not sure if those numbers are available, but I can certainly follow up with that.
I can speak a little bit to some of your questions raised. So in terms of if we specifically as a project were looking for specific nursing disciplines or specific areas where they were coming from, it was just whoever wanted to share their stories with Filipino descent. Uh, the folks who suffered the most in terms of loss or COVID exposure or death were more folks who had direct bedside contacts on the front lines, especially in emergency rooms. Emergency rooms where you didn't really know what was coming. You didn't know if you had to mask up. Most of them were already, but you didn't know what the potential exposure was. My mom was an ER nurse as well, and so thinking of the uncertainty that comes with. I mean, with some of the folks that we've interviewed, people were self-quarantining in between their shifts in their own homes and kind of self-isolating away from their families. And so, yes, to your point, it definitely is a structural issue as well. The second point of that is because of the economic policies that are pushed, oftentimes these nurses are signing their contracts for employment and labor back in the Philippines. They have agencies that are dedicated to the outsourcing of labor in the Philippines, again, because of the incentivization of economic policies. And so oftentimes they go to these places in order to find cheaper sources of labor because it's an American paycheck that to a Filipino back in the Philippines is an American paycheck, right? Whether that's equitable in terms of the pay for scale here in the United States, that's not necessarily something that they are looking at because they are looking to leave the country in order to have higher standards of care that they can provide incentives or financial obligations for their families back in the Philippines. And so it very much is structural thing because of the level of exploitation that these populations are vulnerable to. And then for the data related to kind of COVID incidence or mortality and Filipino communities in general, that's why disaggregation of Asian American data is so important because a lot of the data at the state level, at the county level, they are aggregate numbers for all Asian Americans that don't hone into specifically Filipino communities or populations. And so that data is something that I have really struggled to find for my own academic work. And it's something that I'm hoping that through the work that Dr. Manal is doing, as well as the rest of our team, as well as other people who are doing parallel efforts across the United States, that this is something that can be really pushed and advocated for. Thank you.
I mean, Carlo is absolutely right because Carlo hits the nail on the head that and what Nina was saying about like disaggregated data, that it's just sorely lacking. And that's why some of these questions, that's what we're working on at the moment, is trying to understand that and work with other related medical organizations who we have multiple connections with the Philippine Nurses Associations across the country in attempting to find out that information. It just takes time because disaggregating takes time. And so, but thank you though. And I would love to hear people in the room or people who are listening in, just their feedback or just their thoughts about what struck them about today's talk, thoughts to consider, and what mattered to them today in hearing this.
Yeah, one thing that struck me was just the level of devotion that these nurses had to their work. And Carla, forgive me, what was the term that you had mentioned?
Utang na loob.
Yeah.
That
And-
indebtedness.
Yeah, and I was wondering too, especially with given the scale of harm experienced by the Filipino nurses, if there in your interviews, if there are any people who ended up coming around and questioning it. Just after all the like structural failures that they've been.
To clarify, are you specifically talking about like the religiosity or the like structural?
Like having, while expressing that they have this level of like devotion to their work, but if they ever came around and like questioned. Is this something, or is this something that I don't know, just like a level of like anime kind.
April, would you like to respond? I can also say some words, but if you would like to say
Yeah,
anything.
you can go ahead and respond, then I'll chime in. Go ahead, Carl, please.
So in some of the interviews that I've conducted, looking at, and also just anecdotal experiences, talking with my mom who's a nurse, my family friends and other aunts who are nurses, my uncle who was a nurse in Saudi Arabia, who was there for I think 20+ years and moved back to the Philippines, I think like a few months before COVID really picked up. A lot of them were actually rather emboldened by their line of work and thought that this is what they were supposed to be doing. I think my mom's a unique case. I think she was just like, oh, I'm ready to retire. But also maybe it's just that familiarity, right? And being able to express. But thinking about the safety, not only want to express that, but then also just thinking about how they go about surviving the conditions of work that they might be finding themselves in. I think that one, it's their paycheck, right? It's their source of income. It's something that they're using to survive. And so I think there's also this internal dialogue that's happening where this is what I'm doing, this is what I gotta do, and I'm gonna push through it. And it's good because not only helps support me and my family, but then also I'm helping take care of other people. And there is that really deep-seated element of care, is what kind of why we went with healing heritage for the neighborhood project. And looking at the experiences that these nurses are having, they're really wanting to give back, if not because of, you know, the gratefulness for American citizenship or permanent residency, or for the income that comes along with it, just because it's how we're raised, right? The expectations, the norms that we're brought up, the values that we have. And a lot of folks aren't conscientiously considering, I have to do X, Y, and Z within my role and self-sacrifice through COVID because of utang na loob, but it's just something that is
Yeah.
kind of implicitly norm. People, would you like to?
Yeah, I mean, I think Carlo hit the nail on the head, and that was a really great question, by the way. Thank you for that. I mean, and what I'm also observing in their interviews is a lot of the nurses are saying that they were just in the moment and they did not have time to process it, and that during these interviews it was a very therapeutic time for them because it was actually the first time since the pandemic that they had been able to even talk about it, process it, or think about what was that. And so I think that it's just like in these moments that they're now trying to figure out what this all means. And so I think that is a great question to think about as we proceed with the interviews, is if how are they responding post-COVID with this idea of indebtedness? Because at the time they really felt like, oh, I'm so grateful that I can serve, and this is like, this religious idea, the calling, like feeling like you're called to serve God, you're called to serve others. And so it's something beyond just, oh, I'm collecting money to send home to the Philippines, but it's a calling from God to serve others. And so there is certainly a lot of trauma and PTSD that they are still processing. And so the question remains to be seen. I think we'll have a better understanding over time and as we complete these interviews in the next year.
I also, to April's point, on the trauma, that is so salient in terms of what's coming up, especially as we move into times that are less COVID afflicted, we are still in the middle of a pandemic, it's just becoming normalized. And so when we think of also this term moral injury, I don't know if I really like provided background within it, the presentation or like the context earlier, but this idea of moral injury is, especially in the nursing workforce, you know what you have to do in order to save a patient, but you can't do it because of a lack of resources or a lack of access. There were so many nurses who, in the podcast that I heard that our team is compiling, or just from other anecdotes of what the experiences are. There were floors that were short-staffed because entire shift coverages were wiped out, not wiped out, excuse me, were suspended. I don't know the right term. They were not allowed to work because they were exposed to COVID or they had COVID. So they were just not coverage, first of all. Lack of ventilators. A lot of hospitals were short on resources. And so they were seeing these COVID patients come in and they knew what had to be done in order to save their lives and provide them with quality care, but they couldn't because the healthcare system, the lack of resources, the 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 burnout that was occurring was just so overwhelming that it led to this shift where a lot of people have left the nursing workforce since, which is something that like is still very much needed. But when we look at the impact that COVID-19 has had, a lot of people, because of the burnout, have decided to take an early retirement, do a career pivot, take a break from nursing or go to nursing specialties that are less intensive or traumatic. Again, thinking of the different options that they have. And so there is also that impact in terms of what we're seeing just 3 years later, after like the peak of the pandemic. And so I think also to April's point about the trauma that's experienced is when you are seeing death on a daily basis and you know that you can't do anything about it, there's this feeling of helplessness that is also elicited. And so a lot of people, as April mentioned, these interviews that we were conducting were sometimes their first time processing and talking out loud about what their experiences were. As I mentioned in one of the slides, 73% of Filipino Americans have never utilized a mental health care service. And so when we think of the impact of cultural values, stigma around mental health care that people are brought up with, and the need for it, given the COVID-19 pandemic and anti-Asian violence, it's like a perfect storm, right? There are all these factors that are swirling around that really contribute to a mental health crisis.
I just wanted to share some comments in the chat. Someone wrote, as a daughter of Filipino nurse, I absolutely love this webinar and the fact that you're researching this topic. I hate that I have to run to another meeting, but will this recording be shared? And I just wanted to let people know that yes, once we caption, one of my students captions the video, we will definitely have it on our YouTube channel so that you can have it, and we'll share the link with people through our listserv, if you're on our listserv. Someone said, this was extremely insightful. I was 100% unaware that this crisis was even amongst us. And then also another person said, I was surprised by the statistics of Filipino nurses with COVID who died during that time was astronomical in comparison to the number of nurses that are Filipino. That was very sad to see. I did have some questions for you all because this is a multi-state project with a lot of moving parts. Number one, how did you coordinate with people from different states? What's the IRB situation? Because that's always an interesting thing if you're working with universities or, you know, any type of sort of interviews and stuff like that too. And number three, how can people or even students get involved, and what is the type of training that you have if people want to get involved?
I can answer that, and I really appreciate I just really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Thank you so much for having us. Like, this has been just so illuminating. And So in terms of the way that the IRB works, it is tricky. And so what we make sure we do with every single interview is we always ask for consent and make sure that that's really important. And we also have full disclosure, like we let them know that if at any point in time they're uncomfortable, we can stop it, and that but if they're comfortable and we have their consent, then we will use some of their interviews as part of a podcast or for social media. And so, and what we've done is, because I am blessed with two amazing co-investigators and an amazing team with Carlo as the head researcher. What we do is we parse out the different sites, and so each co-PI in each university takes care of their own IRB with their own interview sites. Otherwise, it could just be like impossible for every university to have IRB for every site. So we just parse that out. And if students are interested, we are always looking for motivated people who are passionate about this project. We are always open to more people who would like to conduct. We're looking for people who are interested in conducting interviews. For instance, if they have a personal contact of a Filipino nurse who worked during the pandemic in the Philippines, where we're having trouble. We need more help with recruiting, with finding Filipino nurses to interview in California, for instance. So if you know a Filipino nurse that worked during the pandemic, that's valuable, and who would be interested in interviewing for this project, that is a huge help, because the more people we have, more Filipino nurses that share their stories, then the stronger voice that we have as a community, and lifting out the stories from the margins and bringing it to the center. And so if any student is interested, do please reach out. And I'm volunteering Carlo to be the contact person. Just because he's very charismatic and excellent with people. I'm a bit of the shy and awkward one. So yes, so please reach out to Carlo, and we would love to include the people that are important to you in your life and hearing their stories. And if you actually would like to conduct interviews and volunteer for this project, please, like, the more interviews we have, the stronger this project is, and the more that we can share and illuminate the Filipino nurses' stories. That's what we're here for. That's what this is about.
I'm also
Thank
going to quickly follow that up with,
Please.
if you would like to get in contact about supporting the project in any way, shape, or form, please visit us at healingheritage.org. There is a contact sheet that you can fill out in order to send us a message.
You.
Yeah, I think we still have.
We have a lot of time, but I also want to give back people's time if they prefer. Any questions, comments in the chat? People who have attended. Last comments.
One quick question.
Go ahead.
And it's kind of following up.
Risa, can you come
Yeah.
here closer?
How are you? And this is for April and for Carlo, is like,
Sure.
how forthcoming are your participants in this? And I mean that in a way, like, I when I was trying to help y'all recruit, I got a lot of pushback from folks because they didn't have capacity, they didn't have time. Most of them are already practicing nurses, so their time is kind of already limited
Yeah.
in some respects. But then I also think about, like, how many, I recognize that this is important work, but how do you market yourself a little bit, like the study? And then also, like, thinking about, again, how do we get greater participation, and like how
Yeah.
forthcoming are folks? I'm just curious as a researcher.
They're really forthcoming once they sign up.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and that's something that takes, so what we're talking about now is the question about qualitative research methods and how you can increase compliance. And that is a universally challenging question for all qualitative sociologists. And so I think that in my specific case, because when Carlo met me, this started off as a small, intimate community project. in my community, where I've been a longstanding community member in Hampton Roads. And so having a, there's this like stereotype, oh, you should be objective and you shouldn't have any connection, and the people are like, you're here as a scholar and they're there, and like, that's not how actual really good sociology works. Having connections with the community, having a personal and an emotional investment builds trust. And so as an insider in the community, that allowed the trust and the rapport in order for the Filipino nurses. And I knock on wood, like, I thank God that they trusted me for that with that information. And so having community connections helps. And then, and it's called the snowball method. So by Carlo and I coming out here today with our connection to Nina, and so gracious to have us here today, and then meeting you all lovely folks at the talk, like, you might know someone that's a Filipino nurse that you'd like their story to be told. So it's like that. So we just try to build on that snowball method of the personal connections of the people that we meet, and we try to build onto that. But again, it's a universal and salient challenge, and the further we get away from our personal connections, the harder it is, because they're busy, and like, of course they have a lot to do. And so at the same time though, I think that a lot of the Filipino nurses understand that this is a story that needs to be told, and that if they don't tell the story, then no one will, because it wasn't told before. I was Googling Filipino COVID nurse stats during the pandemic, and I found maybe one website at the time. And I think there's only a handful. And in terms of scholarly research, I mean, there's some, but there's still very little. And this project, as far as I'm aware of, is the most comprehensive geographically and in terms of the depth of it to date. And so it's ambitious, it's daring, and I hope we can pull it off. Knock on wood. And with your support, that will help greatly. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll also follow up. So April earlier mentioned the importance of having kind of like different researchers in charge of their own hubs. And so that's really been a huge help in terms of being able to parse the work and approach it in a manageable way.
Yeah.
My aunt is located in Chicago. She's part of the research team. I recruited her. But she is a nurse with, I think, 2 decades of, you can read her bio on our website, but like over 2 decades of bedside experience, has been a clinical nursing professor for, I think, like at least like another 20 years. And she is currently doing her PhD in nursing at Loyola University, Chicago. And so her work and being connected with so many different hospitals and communities. I think she was also involved in the Philippine Nurses Association chapter in Illinois for the greater Chicago area. Like, tapping into that was super beneficial and helpful in supporting the project. Dr. Christian Gloria, who's one of our co-investigators, his connections as a Filipino researcher up in New York City has been really helpful. He's located at Columbia University Medical Center, so the nurses that he can hopefully reach out to, and he's been super supportive in helping us recruit, and also not just recruit nurses to interview, but then also other research staff. So he's connected us with a lot of Philippine researchers from the Philippines who also have connections back
Absolutely.
home in the Philippines to kind of look at those nurses who are located out there. And so again, thinking of this work is not done in a vacuum, but it's also not done alone. As you mentioned, like when I came to your talk, it was very much Hampton Roads, North Hampton, Newport News. That's where like the focus was. And after talking, I think we just saw the need to look at this from different communities and having being able to look at the same data across different communities, because so much
And
of
on a
the
global perspective, yeah.
so much of the research, especially on Filipino communities, is centered and based out of California or the West Coast in general, or Hawaii. And so being able to have that consistency with the data collected, and also seeing how the different geographic locations differ from each other, or have parallel findings, is also really important to consider. And so that was kind of the push for the approach to have a more broad sampling method.
Absolutely. And I do want to acknowledge our newest co-project investigator, Dr. David Chow, who is the head of the Asian American Christianity Center at Princeton University. And so so we're utilizing all of our partnerships with their levels of expertise and their contacts and communities and connections in order to propel this project forward.
Thank you. I'm gonna piggyback off of your comments as well, is because so I teach the Asian American Experience class, and I've been telling my students the importance of networking.
Yes,
As well as the importance of sharing stories, because our stories,
absolutely.
especially stories of the APDIA community, are not. We're not in the history books unless you're, we're not required classes, we're sort of add-ons, right?
Yeah.
And so I wanted to sort of impress upon students on in Zoom, but also students in general, to really think there are so many ways to get involved, and there's there's so much research that needs to be done. Because the stories aren't being told.
Yeah.
So can I just ask, before we all go,
Sure.
what's sort of one story that each of you have sort of, it resonated with you, like doing this research, like whose story really resonated with you and why? And then why was it important to share that story? Especially for us who may not hear about it, read about it.
Would you like to go first, April?
Sure, yeah. So I will keep the name anonymous, but I remember one particular interview, and this Filipino nurse was telling me that it was at the height of COVID, and there was a time when there were so many people dying, but they were not allowed to see their family members. And so they had to die alone. And they could have the iPad, but still, it wasn't the same as being there with them. And so I remember this nurse was sharing that she was holding like she didn't know the patient, but yet she still held their hand and she prayed for them. She prayed for them. And she said that she prayed for all of her patients every day. And that just really struck me, like just holding a stranger's hand as they were dying. I just couldn't imagine that.
Again, keeping this person's name anonymous, in the context of COVID and anti-Asian hate, kind of the unexpected situations that you might find yourself in, working as a nurse in a medical institution, in a large metropolitan area. Oftentimes there's this illusion of safety, but this person had shared with me that, you know, being called out because of the shape of their eyes, or you know, saying, "Oh, I don't want this person to be my nurse because they are gonna infect me with COVID," right? And it's like this duality of trying to provide care for someone who is one already infected with COVID, and wanting to provide quality care and just do their job, but then not being allowed to because of the perceptions of their identity. And so having the experiences be really hard in terms of what am I supposed to do? How do I remain professional? How do I, you know, this person's a patient, this person's customer. My job is to care for them. I want to care for them, but they are not letting me. And so trying to kind of come to terms with things that are out of their control in terms of perceptions was really striking. And then how they process that after, right? Again, thinking about them not having mental health care, which they started seeing a therapist, being able to actually connect with someone to just reflect back on their experiences and recognize that this was not in my control and I did what I could. But yeah, again, thinking about like the helplessness that comes with that. So many times, like Filipinos like push this narrative of resiliency, as with a lot of immigrant communities, folks of color. And the fact of the matter is they shouldn't have to, right? The systems and the structures in place should have an equity focus so that all people are cared for and are safe and secure and have their basic needs met. But unfortunately, that's not the situation that we are finding ourselves in. And so the question comes back to what can we change within the system through policies, through advocacy, through different multifaceted approaches or interventions that really help to provide that sense of safety and security and health for all. I think that's like the biggest thing. My background working in public health and mental health as well, thinking of how that reflects back to the decisions that are handed down oftentimes without our consent or
Yeah.
knowledge or input. And so this project really is aiming to do just that. It's trying to uplift the stories of folks who have been so far out of the margins where, for going back to your point, Teresa, where they're not wanting to either engage in the research because they don't think that matters or no one's going to listen to them, because they have so many other things that are competing for their time and their prioritization. How do we find, or how do we show people the value in hearing stories? And for having this data come out, I think is
Yeah.
one of the things that is really important as an outcome of this conversation, of this project, but also something that's like consistently trying to be worked towards as well.
Yeah, and like as Nina was saying, and it's at the top of my notes actually for today, which is the value of storytelling. Your stories matter. Our stories matter and they need to be told. And we don't want people to suffer in silence.
Many generations, that's how it's been, right? And so thinking of how we can change the narrative, how we can push for these changes, whether, and there's some folks who will never be comfortable with engaging in a research study or like just what they might see as complaining or just like making their issues known. But it's about these, it's a paradigm shift, right? Within the culture, how can this be made more aware of? And April's point is very much is that snowball effect, snowball sampling, snowball effect. But hopefully by having more people share their stories, people find the value because finally someone who looks like them, who has their needs and their interests and their care in mind, is prioritizing this and uplifting the work that's being done.
Thank you. We had one more comment in the chat is I'm grateful for the opportunity to be a part of this forum. It has been very informative. I too find it interesting that there's little to no coverage surrounding the disparities of so many nurses. And thanks for being part of this conversation. So thank you everybody for attending. The APDIA Plus Center has a lot of events, and actually quite a few are related to wellness and well-being, and we have support groups that are also hybrid, so if people are interested, you can also attend online as well. We have monthly nighttime guided meditations once a month for those who are interested, and that's also virtual. So feel free to join our listserv, participate in any way you can as well. Reach out if you have any questions. You can reach out to myself, Alex, if you could put my email in the chat, that would be great. But also know that we have a lot of events and programs, especially for PETA Heritage Month, which is in April. We celebrate in April because May students are gone. But thank you. And thank you again, Dr. Manalang, for coming and for sharing your stories and showing that research can be very personal, because there's always this feeling that we have to depersonalize research, and the reality is much of research is very personal and very deep, and especially for peoples whose stories are not getting told.
Absolutely.
And thank you, Carlo, for always being a wonderful campus partner and collaborator.
Amazing, Carlo. Thank you.
I will share the video out to people, especially to you, April,
Thank-
so that you can share it as well.
Yes, I would love to share it.
And thank you everybody for attending.
I just want to
Yes.
uplift two more resources.
Yes.
If anyone is interested in knowing more about Filipino nurses, I just started this book, but my good friend recommended it to me. It's called A Good Provider is One Who Leaves. It documents one family's specific experience leaving Manila to go out into the nursing workforce. I believe the author who wrote it is from the New York Times. Yeah, want to uplift that. Also, again, thinking back about storytelling and how it is beneficial to understanding the narrative that should be personalized more. Kanlungan is a virtual memorial to all the souls lost as a result of COVID-19, Filipino healthcare providers. So that's KANLUNGAN, and that resource is available also on our resource page on our website, healingheritage.org. And that just shows that some of the stories of those Filipino nurses who have passed beyond what they did for work, who their families were, who their friends were, what they valued, what they enjoyed, and just a good way to honor the lives who've been lost.
Thank you. Thank you again, everyone. And hope you have a safe and peaceful Halloween. All right, bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.